The year is 1405, and the Scottish have control of Berwick-upon-Tweed, a highly coveted city that has already switched possession between the English and Scottish many times. The English army shows up and fires a single cannon round, and the Scottish surrender. At this time, cannons were a terrifying sight to soldiers. Used for the first time during the Battle of Crecy in 1346, there are still stories dating to the late 1400s of cannons showing up on a battlefield and immediately ending battles, sometimes without ever even firing a shot. Europe was one of the few world powers that took advantage of the invention of gunpowder early on, as it ended a sort of stalemate that had formed in European battles. Europe continued to advance its technology for war, and by the 16th century the musketeer was a common yet formidable force on the battlefield. During this time period, the 15th and 16th century, as guns changed drastically and became more common in Europe, war too started changing quite a bit. This period is referred to by some historians as the Military Revolution. Although the introduction of guns clearly marked large changes in how battles were fought, it also had a large impact on European culture itself. Before there were guns on the battlefield, a battle was often not much more than undisciplined masses charging at one another. Much of the army was made up of untrained foot soldiers from the peasant class who joined the army in order to loot and plunder towns that were conquered. There was also the cavalry, which made up a smaller part of the army, but was incredibly important. The cavalry was made up of the elite. It required the most individual training and was thus very expensive. Sons of wealthy families, including those of lords, nobles, and princes themselves, were raised to the military lifestyle and trained in small groups built from the social connections among the upper class. On the battlefield, the cavalry would ride in on horseback at the right moment and scatter or attack the opposing army without much danger to themselves. The first large change due to guns on the battlefield was the need to train men in the use of guns. Guns and gunpowder were more expensive and harder to use than other weapons in war. Because of this, peasants couldn't just jump into the army during times of war and then return to their normal life when the war was over. They had to be trained. This training was at the expense of the military leaders. This took time before a person went to war, and because much time and money was spent on their training, they would be kept in a newly formed standing army for a longer period of time after the war. Effectively, the profession of warrior had been created for the lower class. Also now, due to the greater training of soldiers, there was increased discipline among armies. One of the more obvious results of increased discipline is that troops would not flee in terror, such as when the cavalry would come riding at them. Because of this, and the fact that guns were significantly more deadly than pikes or longbows, the cavalry was being faced with a much greater danger. It was no longer as appealing for members of the elite class to be part of the cavalry. This perhaps led to the largest change. By being raised to fight and being one of the most powerful members of an army, elites were learning to exercise military force in the interest of maintaining their own position in the hierarchy of power. This led to a social class structure where these elites had such power that could easily exist outside the context of a central strong authority. Basically, an army ran under its own authority, and once an elite was out of the army, he would maintain a lot of that authority over the lower class. Such as the almost absolute authority of a feudal lord over a serf. However, as the elite class stopped joining the cavalry, the elites began to lose the power they had been able to self-perpetuate through war. Now lower classes were starting to be trained as cavalry. This gave the lower class soldiers ways to distinguish themselves and the possibility to move somewhat in the class structure. Together, these changes started a rearranging of the social class structure that brought the upper and lower classes closer together. The loss of authority for the elites also led to authority becoming more centralized under a monarch. Feudalism ended around this time, likely in part due to this change in social structure, further aiding in the consolidation of power under the monarch and moving us farther away from the chivalric culture that had existed in Europe. Guns also changed how lands were taken over and made war into a state affair. Writing in the 1520s, historian Francesco Guicciardini calls wars before 1494 protracted, bloodless battles, and that the ruler of a state could hardly be dispossessed. In 1494, however, the French rolled into Italy with a siege train laden with guns and changed that forever. Guicciardini goes on to say that the French, in their invasion of Italy, infused so much liveliness in our wars that up to the present, whenever the open country was lost, the state was lost with it. Wars were transitioning from being something of a sport for rulers to being the political action they are today. Wars began to affect everyone in the warring lands, not just the soldiers fighting in them. This marked the beginning of a transition from focusing on offense to focusing more on the defensive aspects of war in Europe. As a result, fighting began to decrease in Europe, moving the focus of life away from war and allowing people to explore other interests, and effectively paving the way for the Renaissance. Guns were a catalyst of change in Europe during the 15th and 16th centuries. There are the obvious changes in war, known to many as the military revolution, but guns also caused many changes to culture, with both direct and far-reaching indirect consequences. Guns were a large stepping stone from the chivalric culture to the westernized culture that exists in Europe today.